I think the smarter the city gets, the more accessible it will get.
Are you interested in the difference between inclusion and integration? What do you think about disability of people or disability of environment? How can accessibility make the urban environment better for everyone? Stay tuned for answers from Lucas Gil Nadolskis.
What is the future for cities? Do you want to learn more about them? Do you want to know how others think about them? Do you want to be part of the conversation? Then this is the right place.
Welcome to What is the Future for Cities podcast. Today, I will interview Lucas Gil Nadolskis, a PhD student at the Bionic Vision Lab. We will talk about his vision for the future of cities, the city as something to conquer, importance of accessibility compared to disability, and many more. So let's start with a proper introduction. Lucas Gil Nadolskis, with a BS in Computer Science and Neuroscience from the University of Minnesota and an MS in Biomedical Engineering from Carnegie Mellon University, is advancing his research as a graduate student researcher in the Bionic Vision Lab. His work spans autonomous navigation, computer vision, brain-computer interfaces, and enhancing accessibility in data visualization. Lucas started his PhD in Dynamical Neuroscience at the UC Santa Barbara in fall 2023, focusing on developing innovative cortical implants for the blind, a cause close to his heart, as he has been blind since age 5. Beyond academia, Lucas enjoys music, travel, and audio-described content. And with that, Lucas, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for your time. I highly appreciate your opinions on the podcast. As a first step into our conversation, would you be so kind to describe to us who you are?
Thank you for having me on the podcast. My name is Lucas. I'm currently a PhD student at the Bionic Vision Lab at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I work under the supervision of Professor Michael Baylor. My department is the Dynamical Neuroscience department. I previously got my bachelor's in computer science from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, where I also got a minor in neuroscience. And later I got my master's at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh in biomedical engineering. And I've been blind since the age of 5 due to retinoblastoma bilateral. So I have no light perception or any contrast or anything. My research focus on brain implants for the blind. So we are studying the effects of implanting an electrode in the occipital cortex, more precisely in the V1 area of a blind volunteer, through microstimulation and recording from neural activity, understanding the works of the blind visual cortex, and how can we understand better what are the effects the blindness causes on the brain, and how can we use the understanding to develop visual prosthetics to hopefully one day develop a smarter bionic eye.
We have been talking a few times already, and you were also part of the panel conversation in episode 200. Just as a refresher, would you be so kind to describe to us what the city means to you?
What does the city mean to me? I think I have two answers on this. One is as a blind person, and one is in general. As a blind person, it means a challenge, probably the biggest challenge. Earlier this year, I went to the CSUN conference here in California, and it was very interesting to see how many projects were aimed towards helping blind people with urban navigation. There was a lot. People were showing smart canes. People were showing robots that would help you navigate. People were showing apps that would help you crossing streets. There's a lot of research aimed on assisting blind and low vision people on urban navigation. That is required because I think to this day, navigation is the largest barrier to independence that we have as people with disabilities in general. As a blind person, my relationship with the city is one of challenge and one of something that has to be conquered. As a person in general, it's my home. I was born in a big city. I was born in São Paulo, Brazil. That's a city with 12 million people. My uncle was an architect, so he always made a point of bringing me to different points of the city and showing different types of environments within such a large city as São Paulo. So it was the place that I was born and where I grew up. I live now in Santa Barbara, which is a much smaller city. I think our population right now is 90,000. And I miss the feeling of being in a big city. All of my favorite cities in the world are big, New York, London, because I love the feeling of being on the streets and having life around, having people walking, having cars buzzing and noisy, and pretty much everything that makes a city very hard for blind people is also something that I really like. I don't know if that speaks more to my contradictions that I have in life, or if that speaks towards some native feeling or some natured feeling of the place that I was born. So at the same point, the city is a challenge, but it's also the biggest reward possible.
I completely understand this contradiction that the city is the challenge to be conquered, but you want to conquer it because it's your home. We will get back to this, but first, could you please explain how your uncle showed you the city? Because when you visited Melbourne and we were showing you around, it was a challenge for us to show you the city at the same time, not show, but experience the city in a different way. Because when visitors come, we usually show them the city to look at this or view this amazing scenery or whatever. Could you please explain what did your uncle do as an architect who are very visually focused? What did he do to show you the city?
My uncle lived in the center of São Paulo, in downtown São Paulo. It is a very unique place. Downtown São Paulo is known to be very dangerous. It's where a lot of the criminality is in São Paulo. But it's also probably my favorite part of the whole city because it's very old, very European in a way. It's like a lot of the buildings are from the time of when Brazil was still a Portuguese colony. So it is an interesting place where very rich and fine and expensive things live with a gigantic homeless population. It's a very complicated place. But the thing that my uncle used to do was my uncle was never afraid of walking anywhere. So we used to go and walk around these areas and interact with the environment. So we would go to the oldest restaurant in São Paulo, the oldest bakery, or to a building that like the elevators were still the same since like, I don't know, 100 years ago. Or to train stations that were built in manners that were still from the areas that everything was important from England, and talk about it. And, or for example, let's say you go to the music hall and the door is very old, or it's from Portugal, brought by a king or something. And he would spend like 30 minutes talking about the door. So this is really cool because it's a type of wood that doesn't exist anymore. And he would ask me to knock on the door and be like, so do you feel like how it sounds different, how thick it is? And this is all things that like play a very important role in the urban environment itself. Because for example, whenever we are walking to a building and it's like the wall of the building, it's very unique because of some specific fact. And he asked, you can touch this wall and you can feel this or feel that. That accompanied by his technical explanations of how things are built and how things were projected and all of that notion was really interesting. Also, this feeling of walking everywhere. He was never a fan of cars. He always liked to walk and to take public transportation. And he was a lot centered on this idea of experiencing somewhere new. We traveled quite a lot. And I remember when I went with him to England, to London for the Olympic Games, I don't remember where we were going, but I remember that we took the wrong train. His reaction was, instead of let's go back and take the correct train, was let's go to the end of this line and see what's there. And it was funny because the end of the line, turns out it was Wimbledon. So we walked from the train station to Wimbledon. It was a very interesting walk because it was a very steep hill. And it was the first time in my life that I saw public golf courses. Talking about that stuff was like one of the things that I remember from the whole trip was public golf courses in the way between the train station and Wimbledon. So these interactions with the city was really important, and it was a lot thanks to him.
And these experiences are important, even for me, because I usually like to admire the city and its architecture by viewing it and less likely to touch it. But I also very much enjoy the touch of the old bricks or the scent of an old building, because those are full with memories and experiences. And that's a whole another level of the city experience. And I'm glad that someone with architectural background were able to help you understand more of these buildings and cities. This was the past. So let's turn to the future. What does the future of cities mean to you, Lucas?
I think I was much more pessimistic about the future until, say, a month ago. I think the future has a brighter and a darker point. In the brighter side, I think the smarter the city gets, the more accessible it will get. So let's put in a world that we have autonomous buses, which already do in a couple of cities in the US. Instead of you relying on the goodwill of the driver to park the bus and open the door for you and telling you that he's in front of you, you're going to have an app that would notify you that the bus is coming and will tell you exactly when the bus is there. And you can notify through the app to the bus that someone with disability is coming, so the bus can wait longer or whatever. So this integration with smart technologies is really important. Of course, it also poses challenges, especially for older people or people that are not as tech savvy. And I think that is something that people need to keep in mind, is how can we make the city smarter, but still friendly to everyone. But I think this way can be very helpful. The other thing that I talk a lot is traffic lights. Traffic lights are a big challenge for accessibility. There were at least 2 things at this conference that were purely focused on street crossing. I believe that if we have more smart cars or integration with the car systems in general, it'll be much easier to develop an app that will let you know if there's a car passing or not by ways that are not necessarily purely based on computer vision, as it is today. So this is why I think those 2 sides coexist. One is they're getting smarter, which is great for accessibility. However, the dark side is they are getting smart, so they're going to be harder to use for people that are not tech savvy. And of course, you also have the challenges of making the apps accessible. So it doesn't matter if we implement this wonderful bus system, but the app that you would talk with the bus is not accessible. Recently, I tried using the app for a transit system in Southern California, and the app was 100% not accessible. It was the app that will let you know if the bus is arriving or not. And I'm like, this is such an important feature, and it doesn't work. That is something that we should also keep in mind for the future.
I'm glad that you found some ray of sunshine in the doom and gloom we previously discussed. That is really good. Before we move on, what does disability mean to you? And this will be a tactless question. Are you
Yes.
disabled, Lucas?
There is a view of disability that disability is based on infrastructure, not based on the medical model. And there is some push to move on from the medical model of disability. I think there is something on the between. I don't think if you put me in a building that is 1,000% accessible, I'm still blind. The only thing is I'm very functional, but I am still blind. So I think the discussion about disability is much more in terms of English than in terms of meaning. Because being disabled, for me, for example, means that I cannot see. So unless we change this through something, which could be brain implants or it could be whatever, unless we restore sight, you still have a disability, which doesn't mean that you are not functional, or it doesn't mean that you are not independent. You can be a very independent, very functional human being and have a disability. I live alone in a foreign country for 10 years. My entire family is in Brazil. I moved by myself to Minneapolis when I moved from São Paulo to start my undergrad. I got a very competitive bachelor's program. I got one of the best master's programs possible, which is in Carnegie Mellon, and I'm doing a PhD in neuroscience. I'm not bragging about this. I'm saying that I did all of that stuff being blind. Does that mean that I am not disabled? No, I'm still disabled, but I am very able to do what I'm doing. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. But I'm not able to. I got in a flight, and on that flight, the button to call for the flight crew was touchscreen. So that was a reminder that I cannot do that. Oh, but let's say that we made a world. Everything's accessible. Everything's accessible. Everything is great. Look at that. You still can't see. You can't see nature. You can't see faces. You can't see the sky. You can't see a movie. You can watch a movie by using audio description, but you are not seeing it. Of course you are losing something. The biggest question is not asking if I am disabled. I think the question is how much being disabled is put me in a worse condition compared with everyone else. And that depends. That depends. There are things that I can even do better than other people. If I take my research, for example, the whole reason that I'm able to do my research is because I am blind and I have still vision memory from the part that I was sighted. So I can talk with future implantees. I can give researchers feedbacks that they cannot get from anywhere else because I have both the blindness and the research perspective. So that is something that I can do better than someone that is strictly sighted. But I'm doing that without seeing the face of the person that I'm talking to. That still means that I have a disability.
There were some very interesting snippets in your description. And thank you very much for clarifying.
By the way, this is a very hot debate. Like me saying this, and whenever this goes public, it will ricochet on me. Because this is a debate that disability community has. I have a very different point than most people because I think because I work a little bit with the medical model because of my research. This is in any way a general opinion. This is my opinion. And I think this is an important point to clarify. I stand by it. I fight for it because I think thinking that there is a view that like blind people can do everything. And I think that's dangerous. It's not only wrong, it's straight up dangerous. Because if you are telling me that I can do everything, I can't drive. And if you are telling this to parents of a child that is going blind now, you're going to generate false hopes. You're going to generate a whole bunch of issues that are going to be very difficult to deal with whenever you are older. The way that my parents dealt with it was interesting. I remember when I was, 12, 13, and I told my dad that I was not feeling well. My dad was like asking why. And I told him I'm feeling bad because I am never going to be able to drive. And my dad looked at me and was like, yeah, you won't. You know what does that mean? What? You're always going to be able to drink. You're never going to be the designated driver. So by making this joke, you're putting the reality of something. Yeah, you're not going to be able to drive. This is a bad thing, though. Not necessarily. It is a bad thing because you're going to have more problems going to school or going to work. But whenever you are going to a bar, you're going to always enjoy it.
And thank you very much for stating that this is your opinion. I appreciate your opinion and that you share it. You also talked about disability of people versus disability of the environment. Could you please talk a bit more about this distinction?
Person having a disability, in my opinion, means that person cannot perform something due to a condition. Let me give you an example. Let's take someone who is very healthy, is sighted, is hearing able, is everything perfect. But this person is, let's say, 2 meters tall, or I don't know, whatever is that on feet, 6'5", 6'6". That person is not able to sit on some specific chairs. That person is not able to sit on a plane seat. That is a difference. Is this person disabled? No, they're not, because in terms of health and in terms of physicality, they're great, but they are dealing with a disabled environment because the environment is not prepared for someone that tall. However, let's take someone who is blind and goes to the same situations. This person deals with the seat of the plane and the environment and the chairs and everything, but they can do everything that the tall person cannot do. So the environment is not disabled for this blind person in this specific term, but this person is still blind, so this person still has a disability. Because while the tall person can look at something, the blind person can't. I think the core of everything is we start talking about what is the default position of human beings. Biologically, human beings are sighted. Biologically, human beings can hear. Biologically, human beings can do all of that stuff. Whenever you lose that, in terms of senses, you are becoming disabled. And I think this is the biggest contrast. I think then we start talking about what is natural and not. I start getting into terminology that like, I am digging my grave here. I think there is an assumption that whenever you say someone is disabled, you mean that someone is not functional or is not productive, which could not be more wrong. There are a bunch of people that has no disability and are absolutely like at home doing nothing or lazy or whatever, but they are able to do stuff. People that can see or can hear cannot. So I think that's a very delicate thing. Talking about disability of environments, it's complicated because are you going to expect that every environment is able to accommodate everyone? I think this is a little bit of a false hope. If you go to London, for example, and can you make every train station accessible? It would be incredible if you do. But is it realistic? I don't know. People sometimes want to believe that we are able to live in this utopia. They're like, oh, no, if we, through activism or through anything, we can make this environment accessible to everyone. It's like, yeah, sure, that would be awesome. But can we?
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. And it's very interesting to hear you talk about the disability of the environment, because that's a new perspective for me, for example, and it's good to think about that aspect as well. So we can help the environment to be more accessible in general, and then every person could navigate it not perfectly, but at least easier. Which brings me to the question, what does accessibility...
You read my thoughts. I was literally going to ask if you could ask this question. Because I think asking what accessibility means is much more important and much more useful than asking about what disability means. Because disability, you cannot do anything about it. now. Of course, you can have cochlear implants and stuff, but you cannot necessarily solve this problem now. However, accessibility is something that we can actively do. And one very important thing about accessibility is accessibility usually helps everyone. So we usually give this example about teaching. So if you take a professor that is very used with showing slides and talking about slides and assuming that everyone is looking at that slides, this is proven in research that this class is much less effective than a class that the professor doesn't just read the slides, or just doesn't show the slides, but actually talks about the content and explains in depth what each slide means. This is a much more accessible class for blind people, but it's helping everyone. I clearly remember when I was taking a calculus class, and my professor was explaining what an integral was. He kept showing a curve and showing there another curve. Oh, this is an integral. This is an integral. I'm like, what in the hell is he talking about? So one day I called him and I went to his office hours, and he started explaining to me the basics of an integral in terms of calculus theory and going into very conceptual things. And I got it. At a certain point, I actually got it. And I realized that this information would be useful to actually share in class. And the next day he shared that in class, and a bunch of people after the fact reacted, telling us that they finally understood integrals. So something that he thought about explaining to me ended up being useful to the class. This is accessibility. Accessibility is not making something for blind people. Accessibility is thinking, how can you change the environment in a way that is useful for a blind person and also for a sighted person? This is happening a lot in gaming right now. There used to be this movement of making audio games. Still is, but it used to be much more prominent. Audio games are basically games that doesn't have any image. So they're only based on audio. I was never a fan of them because as cool as they are, they don't integrate. They are great for blind people to play either by themselves or with other blind people. Oh, but you can play with your sighted friends. Yeah, of course you can. But are you going to convince a sighted child to play a game that doesn't have images? No, you won't. Now, lots are pushing this view of making regular games accessible. I know that Forza is doing it. Last of Us Part 2 was a big one. This is incredible. This, for me, is much more accessible than an audio game because it allows me to play against my sighted friends. Because let's face it, most of the world is sighted. I won't be able to play something against the largest number of people. For that, I need to have both interesting visuals and audio descriptions. So for me, this is accessibility. It's much more related with integration of someone with disabilities with other people and with the environment.
It's amazing how we can think of accessibility just using one specific group instead of thinking of, okay, if we create an accessible space, that would help everybody to experience that space better.
And even among other disabilities, for example, let's say that if you make closed captions and you make closed captions for deaf people, okay, that's great. But if you can save those closed captions and generate a transcript, that's great for blind people as well, because for us to take notes using a screen reader and listening to the class at the same time is difficult. Those captions are not only helping deaf people, but they're also helping blind people. Or if you use ramps instead of staircases, then you are helping people in wheelchairs, you are helping guide dogs, you are helping everyone. It's really important to think about how can you develop a solution that you can assist the broadest groups instead of thinking about how can we make this accessible for blind people or whatever.
Lucas, what are your 3 biggest fears regarding the future of cities?
Electric cars and buses. Lack of accessibility on apps. So as I was giving earlier the example of the Buzz Interact app, and dependence on visuals. So as we develop smart buses, we develop better technologies for street crossing, better technologies for everything, there is a push to make beautiful visuals or to make signs that look better and all of that. One of my fears is that those visuals are going to be harder, for example, a computer vision algorithm, or that the dependence on visuals will, for example, instead of having Braille to say something, if instead of the text you have an image, you cannot have Braille to do that. So dependence on visuals is scary.
What do you mean by the electric cars?
Because they have no noise. You can hear them. It's much easier for you to be ran over by them. And not only that, but for example, I had an Uber the other day that had a Tesla. I couldn't find a car. I didn't know that he was parked in front of me for 5 minutes because I didn't hear him coming.
That's a fair concern. And then what are the 3 biggest opportunities?
Integration with smart technologies, such as I was giving the example of the bus before. Same thing you can say about, we can integrate that with Alexa or Google Assistant or whatever. I hope that we decrease the number of accidents of people getting ran over, which is a big problem in the blind community. And I think this is not about the city, but this is in general. I think the world is pushing towards accessibility. Being accessible is becoming trendy. So I think all of these concerns, I think that like people in the future will have more ears to hear the concerns of people with disabilities and to actually make something accessible.
And for that, what would you like people know about blind people?
I think one thing that is important to clarify, it is important to understand that blind people are primarily people and not primarily blind. That means that blind people were not restricted by the fact that they're blind. That doesn't mean that if you are blind, you're going to necessarily work with accessibility, or you're going to necessarily work making stuff for other blind people, or that you're going to have specific types of jobs or practice specific types of sports. As you don't restrict someone from Australia to practice some sport, or you don't restrict someone from Hungary to read the specific types of book. In the other way is that blind people don't want people to have pity of us, because nothing is worse than pity. And I think this is becoming less common now than it was decades before. But I always think it's fascinating when I'm talking with someone that I just met and I tell them what I do from my research. Every time the reaction is, God damn it. I don't know if that would be the same reaction if I was sighted. And I think it's more shocking to them that like a blind person is doing all of that stuff. I can understand it in a way because it's not common to see blind people doing this type of stuff. But the fact that people are still surprised tells a lot about what people expect blind people to do. So it's important to not have a pre-idea of what someone's going to do because they have a specific condition.
To be honest, I am still in awe because of your work and what you are doing, but it's not because you are blind, but because you are a neuroscientist and you are working with people's brain data. That is freaking awesome. You also mentioned that there is an uptake in accessibility. Do you have any idea why is it now an uptake?
There is an increase on awareness about minorities in general. The world is more concerned about every minority. We are aiming to have a world that is more acceptance towards anyone. And people with disabilities get thrown into that mesh. Sure, I take anything that would help. I'm not picky. I'm not going to say that I wouldn't accept this because it's not coming from a place of, oh, let's help people with disabilities, coming from a place of like, how can we make something that's going to make us look good in social media? In the end, I am helped with both ways, whatever. The opposite is true as well. Because of social media and because of how powerful it is for you to complain about stuff, people are more scary about making something that is not accessible. And then you go on Twitter and you tell them that something's not accessible. And now, boom, they are known as someone that did not care about the blind person doing that. And accountability is becoming a thing. So I think it's a general change in society in general, to be honest.
And during all of this talk on disability and accessibility, you haven't mentioned the term inclusion.
I think I did when I mentioned about integration. Whenever I was talking about accessibility, I mentioned integration. I think it's more a question of English. I think inclusion would be, okay, we are doing X. How can we include someone that is blind? But that can look in a bunch of different ways. So let's say they're like, oh, we are playing video games. How can we include a blind person? We can include a blind person by telling them what we are doing. That's including them. But it's not integrating. Integrating is letting them to also play it. So I think in one way, integration is much more powerful of a term.
Thank you for the clarification. And I appreciate that inclusion can be understood in many ways. Integration is more powerful for you.
I think it can also be because I'm thinking in mathematical terms. I think integrating comes easier for me than inclusion.
What are the three biggest strengths regarding the future of cities for you?
I think I will refer back to my answer on the three biggest opportunities, because I think they are the same. Because I think the opportunities that we are having comes because of the strengths of the future in terms of developing better technologies, having more social awareness. I think one thing that I didn't mention as well, and it's important, is increasing information about people with disabilities. So people are becoming more informed about what blind people can do, about what people in wheelchairs can do. And that alone also helps on the other issues.
Lucas, you have been very generous with your time and answers. So I would like to ask you, what is your role in establishing the future of cities?
I think the role of every person with disabilities on making the future of the cities is to communicate with people that have the conditions to change something. So let me give you an example. No one will put talking traffic lights in a corner if we don't tell them that we need that. The gold standard in accessibility is that the person requiring the accommodation is the biggest specialist in the subject matters of accessibility. So if you are talking about making a class accessible, you should ask the student what they need. Or if you are making an app accessible, you need to run user tests. And I think in terms of the city is the same thing. If we are going to make an accessible city, you need to ask people with disabilities about it. But also people with disabilities should tell when something is not right and have the initiative to reach out and say something and think about solutions and suggest solutions. It is much better whenever you talk with someone to already suggest a solution than be like, hey, this is a problem. If you have the conditions of thinking about how you would better solve the problem and proposing that to whoever is in charge, it's much easier. So I think this is primarily my role, is to identify where the issues are and let people know what I would need from them to fix those issues.
Do you have any closing comments or requests for the audience?
I think in general, my request would be that people understand that people with disabilities are primarily people and not primarily a disability. I was talking with a friend recently about it, and we were talking about how we like the person first versus the identity first language. So I always present myself as a neuroscientist or a PhD student in neuroscience who happens to be blind, not a blind neuroscientist. or a blind PhD student. I think this is important, is to treat and to see people with disabilities as functional beings in the city and interact with them this way. So if you see someone in a wheelchair, someone who uses cochlear implants, or a blind person or a deaf person or whoever, it is really important to first assimilate that they are a person, they are a professional, they are a student, they are an engineer, they are whatever, an architect. And if we all do this, it's already a huge step towards making this city more accessible to everyone.
This sounds amazing. And Lucas, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. That was awesome.
It was really interesting to hear from Lucas about his distinction between inclusion and integration, not to mention his call to action for everyone to talk to each other about the different lived experiences. Damien Hewitt described his experience in working with the proper stakeholders creating better outcomes in episode 147. You can find out more about Lucas online. All the links are in the show notes. What was the most interesting part for you? What questions did arise regarding Lucas's approach to the future of cities? What have you learned from this interview? Let me know on Twitter at WTF4Cities or on the WTF4Cities.com website where the transcripts and show notes are available. You can also subscribe on the website not to miss any new episodes and leave some feedback. I hope this was an interesting interview for you as well, and thanks for tuning in.
What is the Future for Cities podcast?